In 1887, when Britain celebrated the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, she was still the richest and most powerful country in the world. Her government and way of life was stable and assured. She seemed as changeless and everlasting as the old Queen herself. Britain's power was based on industrial wealth. Over the past 100 years, she had established a massive lead over all other nations. She had been the only great industrial state, the world's leading producer of iron, coal, ships, textiles, and other manufactured goods. The skilled British workmen had learnt the importance of combining into trade unions or friendly societies to protect themselves from their employers. For British manufacturers drove a hard bargain. They were thrifty and shrewd and determined that Britain should remain the workshop of the world. The wealth produced in the workshop went into very few pockets. About 250,000 people owned nearly 3/4 of the country's wealth in land, capital, and rents. Income tax was only 6p in the pound. Death duties were light and profits rose steadily year by year. The British upper classes were the richest in the world. They could indulge in every form of luxury. Few of them realized, and even fewer cared, at what a tragic price their prosperity had been bought. Huge industrial cities, ugly and insanitary, hastily built to shelter the millions of laborers needed for the factories, hideous slums, and the misery of the people who lived in them. In spite of acts of parliament, local government regulations, and the efforts of philanthropists, millions of people lived in subhuman conditions. In 1889, it was calculated that the bare minimum for life was £1 a week per family. Over 30% of the population of London, the world's richest city, lived at or below this poverty line. In the East End, the average expectation of life was 23. For the labouring class as a whole, it was 30. The same was true of other industrial cities. Perhaps the most tragic victims were those who worked in what were known as the sweated trades: tailors, sackmakers, bakers, cobblers, who had no factory acts to regulate their working conditions and no trade unions to protect them. For a penny halfpenny an hour, some worked for anything up to 16 hours a stretch. They were pale, emaciated creatures, old before their time. For the unemployed, the old, the disabled, the homeless, the last resort was the workhouse, a gloomy institution, little better than a prison. Thousands of destitute people, bankrupt and broken in spirit, lived out their days in these ghastly places. Among the comfortable classes, the belief still held that the poor are always with us. Charity, public and private, was dispensed on a grand scale. For lower paid workers, even for semi-skilled men, the poorhouse was never far away. A month's unemployment or sickness could mean ruin and destitution, and they too might be thrown on the scrap heap. For many, the only outlet for their bitterness and frustration was violence. The 1870s and 80s were particularly restless times, when Britain suffered her first severe slumps in trade. Thousands were thrown out of work and wages were suddenly cut. The reaction was fierce, exploding into wild demonstrations and riots. The cry went up for 8 hours work, 8 hours play, 8 hours sleep, and 8 bob a day. But these violent outbursts achieved little because they were too disorganized. The trade union leaders did not approve of such undisciplined behavior. They were solid, respectable men, pillars of church and chapel. They had faith in capitalism. Far from being a threat to the established order, they had become part of it. They represented only a small aristocracy of the working class, such as the engineers and the railwaymen. They had fought hard to build their unions and win recognition from the employers. Proud of their own status as craftsmen, they considered unskilled labourers as unworthy of unions. But in the London gasworks, the labourers were beginning to organise. They rose in revolt against inhumanly long hours and poor wages. They were led by Will Thorne, rough and illiterate, but a man of great determination and integrity. In 1889, within 4 months, he'd formed the Gasworkers and General Workers Union with a membership of 20,000. By the mere threat of a strike, they forced the employers to meet their demands. The news of this triumph spread quickly along the banks of the Thames to the docks. The dockers were among the poorest of all workers. The pay was 5p an hour and work was casual and irregular. Every morning they formed a miserable queue, each man hoping to be picked out by the foreman. It was almost like a slave market. Sometimes when they got work, they were too weak to do a full day. They were notorious for hard drinking and gambling. Hardly the best human material on which to build a union. Yet they too found a leader, Ben Tillett, a tiny waif of a man, ex-circus lad, come seaman, with a voice like silver. We had 7 and 6 in the kitty, he said, and all the union machinery was under my hat. But that was enough to inspire the dockers. In August 1889, they stopped work and gathered on Tower Hill to sing Rule Britannia and to hear Tillett speak. Then they marched through the streets of the City of London with their wives and children. Their obvious poverty was a shock to public conscience. After 5 weeks' struggle, the employers gave in and raised the pay to 6p an hour, the dockers' tanner. The dockers' success encouraged other unskilled and semi-skilled workers to form unions. Outside factory gates and at street corners, the message was always the same. Unity is strength. The new unions were more aggressive than the old. They won better pay and conditions for their members, but above all, they gave them confidence and self-respect. Over the next 4 years, the total number of organised workers went up by 750,000. The new leaders first appeared in strength at the 1890 TUC. One of them, John Burns, observed, the old unionists looked like respectable city gentlemen, wore very good coats, large watch chains and high silk hats. The new delegates looked like workmen. They were workmen. Even the old craft unions were becoming larger and less exclusive, as new machines and larger factories blurred the divisions between skilled and unskilled. They had influential allies, such as Bernard Shaw and Beatrice and Sidney Webb. The growing militancy was expressed through a powerful new voice in Parliament, a Scottish miner called James Keir Hardie, a passionate socialist. His election in 1892 as Member of Parliament for West Ham was a milestone in the history of the Labour movement, the first glimpse of a truly working-class party. In 1893, he formed the Independent Labour Party, and in 1900, when the trades unions joined forces with him, the modern Labour Party was born. The new party forged ahead. By 1907, it had over 1 million members and 29 MPs. By 1910, it had 42 MPs and was a force to be reckoned with. Yet political advance did not bring fuller pay packets. Although industry was booming and exports were breaking all records, the workers' share in this prosperity was eaten away by rising prices. In 1904, a quarter of the male workers were earning less than in 1880. 25 shillings a week. In modern money, about £5. In the sweated trades, it was even worse. For a tailor, 13 shillings for a 58-hour week was a good wage. Agricultural labourers were the poorest class. Some earned only 12 and 6. The average wage of 15 shillings had hardly risen for the past 100 years. All attempts to form a union had failed. Even skilled workers were hard hit. Yet the trade unions became stronger than ever before. Between 1904 and 1914, total membership rose to over 4 million, an increase of 2 million in 10 years. The most troubled industry was mining. The miner's job was exhausting, unhealthy, and dangerous. In 1910, over 2,000 miners were killed in accidents, and thousands more were seriously injured. Their wages were so mean that many of them had to work on empty stomachs. Women, too, were still employed in heavy manual work. In 1910, the miners of South Wales voted for a strike. There were bloody clashes between the strikers and the police and soldiers. In a pitched battle at Tonypandy, a striker was killed. After a year, the men were starved into submission. In 1912, there was a national coal strike involving over 1 million men. It was the largest strike the country had ever seen. In 1911, the city of Liverpool was thrown into a state of siege by a ferocious dock strike, which brought trade to a standstill for over a month. The transport workers came out in sympathy. The employers were torn between rage and terror and bombarded the government with demands for more police and soldiers to control disturbers of the peace. Strike fever spread even to the children. Llanelli, August the 18th. Telegram to Home Office from Chief Constable of Carmarthen. Attack made on train under military protection. Shots fired, 2 men killed. Violent explosion in truck containing detonators, causing death of 6 people and injury to many. In London, the same month, the railwaymen, the dockers and the transport workers came out on strike. Wagons rumbled through the streets under police escort. Rumours flew around of fighting at the docks and of ships set on fire in the night. For 4 days, the union leaders had the city in their power. The employers were adamant. Under no circumstances will we consent to any recognition of the Transport Workers' Union. Once again, the government had to bring in the troops. In the 4 years between 1910 and 1914, over 63 million working days were lost through strikes and lockouts. Though most of the wage demands succeeded, the obstinacy of both sides added to the poisonous atmosphere of class war. Many employers still treated trade unions as if they were sinister cloak and dagger organizations. The workers wanted more than fair wages. They want share in the management of industry. Militant ideas spread even among the women and the boys who worked on the removal vans. Office workers, usually docile and modest, formed their own white-collar union. Throughout 1914, the tension mounted as strike followed strike. The unions reorganized their forces. A triple alliance was formed of the 3 giants, the railwaymen, the miners, and the transport workers. Between them, they had the power to bring industry to a standstill. To many people, it seemed as if revolution was just around the corner. But suddenly, a new enemy intervened. Germany. On August the 1st, when the Kaiser's army invaded Belgium, a European war became inevitable. At a peace rally in Trafalgar Square, Keir Hardie shouted, "Down with the imperialist war! Long live the class war!" Yet when the call to arms came, the response from the ordinary working men was immediate and overwhelming. The trade union leaders encouraged their members to join the forces. Many thousands volunteered. But in the industrial towns, over half the recruits were found physically unfit. They were the progeny of generations of undernourished slum dwellers. As the soldiers left for the war in Europe, on the home front, the TUC declared an industrial truce and urged trade unionists to cooperate with the government in training women for factory work. They appealed to their members not to strike during wartime and announced the suspension of normal union rules. Lloyd George as Minister of Munitions, and from 1916 on as Prime Minister, was impressed by this patriotic behaviour. Had Labour been lukewarm, he said, we could never have fought the war. Trades union leaders were brought into the government. Arthur Henderson, the Secretary of the Labour Party, an ex-iron foundry worker, became Home Secretary. Throughout the war, government and trades unions worked together with an astonishing degree of friendly cooperation. But in militant areas like Glasgow, unofficial local leaders, usually shop stewards, stirred up discontent against high prices, war profiteering, and the use of female labour. Wildcat strikes flared up, which threatened to sabotage. By 1918, the industrial truce was strained almost to breaking point. Yet, when peace came in November, the overwhelming emotion was of relief and hope for the future. Hope that the old class war, too, was over.